Subscribe to The Honest Critique for current affairs, movie, book, and product reviews. Also, make sure you press the bell icon to get notified whenever we upload a new video.
The views, information, or opinions expressed during the video series are solely those of the individuals and do not necessarily represent those of The Honest Critique and its employees. The following video contains strong language which may be offensive to some viewers. Viewer discretion advised.
So hello and welcome to another episode of Security Intelligence Terrorism series. Today we have Gail Helt with us. She's a former CIA analyst. She worked from 2003 to 2014 in the agency and spent 2 years supporting President Obama's effort to transfer detainees from Guantanamo Bay prison. She's currently working as an assistant professor of political science at King University and the director of King Security and Intelligence Studies. So thank you so much for taking your time and being on the show.
Thank you so much for inviting me. I really appreciate the opportunity.
So with this invitation and your and this interview, there's just one thing clear that it's CIA people are not unapproachable. Not unapproachable, and it's not that secretive.
I would like to think that we're very approachable. I try to be approachable, and yeah, it's not. It certainly is not the case that we're not allowed to speak of our former employment or affiliation. I just certainly cannot talk about anything classified. So, and I know that you guys know that. So.
Yeah. Oh, don't worry, we won't go into a classified region, but let me start with the first question. So, what's the role of CIA? And if you could put a distinction between the FBI, CIA, and the Department of Homeland Security. And I'll just give a context why I'm asking you this, because the Department of Homeland Security, when it was started post 9/11, it meant to stop WMD attacks in America, in domestic soil. So where does CIA gets involved in this? Like if a domestic attack is planned by foreign actors, will CIA get involved or will it be Department of Homeland Security? Because initially this Bill Clinton, I think, issued a presidential decision through Directive 39 in June 1995 and gave orders to the FBI and made it FBI more powerful. But then it was after the Hart Recruitment Committee decided that it was not prepared, they formed the Department of Homeland Security. So where does CIA lie in this at the moment?
So those are all very good questions. Where to start? So the CIA's primary job is to keep the president, particularly the president, informed of foreign threats. So to provide timely warning, to give the president and the cabinet, of course, time to formulate policy and to respond to any sort of threat to the homeland or to U.S. interests abroad. That is primarily the CIA's focus. It does that through analysis of intelligence from all sources. So open source, signals intelligence, human intelligence, spying, traditional spying, imagery, all of those things. And so the big picture is basically, developed by analysts and sent forward to the president and to cabinet members. Now, CIA is different from the FBI in many ways. The FBI is law enforcement, right? The CIA does not have law enforcement responsibilities or duties. Constitutionally, they can't really, or I'm sorry, statutorily, they can't really do that. So in terms of going out and rounding up terrorists and arresting them through law enforcement activities, they don't do that. That's the FBI's charter. The FBI is in charge of that, of all sorts of intelligence gathering and law enforcement. So they can, follow threats and make the arrests here at home domestically. So that's the difference. And if there's something that the CIA, which is charged, with doing foreign intelligence, is watching overseas, they can certainly pass that information, share that information, and should. And after 9/11, steps were put in place or processes were put in place to make that easier, and expected that information would be shared between agencies. And then once that investigation or once a situation makes it to the homeland, then FBI picks that up or Homeland Security picks that up. And Homeland Security, certainly their intelligence apparatus is much more focused on the terrorism threat, domestic and from international groups here at home within the 50 states, probably more so even than the FBI is, which certainly does focus on terrorism somewhat, but also has, regular, monitoring of criminals and trafficking and drug issues and all of those things. So there's definitely some overlap there, but each agency has its own distinct charter and set of responsibilities.
So I had a two-part question. To begin with, the first part being usually how it's portrayed in cinema usually or in the public eye, that a lot of intelligence is gathered through, say, torture or not so non-violent means. Is that so? And the second part of the question is how does the process of getting all this information from individual sources and then being able to look at things from a bigger picture or from a wide-eye perspective and like putting things together work? Like, what is the process that one may have to follow?
Oh, sure. So to answer the first question, no, the majority of intel that the CIA gets is not derived from torture or abuse. Thankfully, right? Torture is always morally wrong. It is always legally wrong. Unfortunately, the agency did dive into the dark side after 9/11 and did some very, very unspeakable things to a number of men, some who may have been guilty, some who may not have been guilty of anything. Some of those men are still held in Guantanamo today without charges, no trial anticipated, right? This is wrong. This is a black mark on our reputation, and it's something that I rail against constantly. But no, the majority of information does not come from those kinds of activities. They come from legitimate collection efforts. So case officers in the field are recruiting spies. That information is written up and sent back and gets processed, and along with other things, intercepts or imagery or even open source material, because that's useful. All of that stuff is dumped into the analyst's bucket, basically their inbox every morning, and you spend hours and hours sifting through that. Now, when you get really good at it, it doesn't take hours and hours, because you sort of develop an instinct rooted in knowledge, right? Rooted in experience. What is good information? What is bad information? Or what is not yet verified, and therefore you can't run with it yet. So you have this whole bucket of information that you're sifting through, and sometimes you see things that you realize this rises to the level of something that the president needs to know about. Or sometimes it's not that urgent. Sometimes it's lesser than that. Sometimes it's, you know what, I think that there's some shifting here. Maybe I need to update policymakers generally. Doesn't necessarily need to go to the president, but it should go to everybody else, right? And so you write a different kind of piece. And that's basically, from the analytic perspective, that's kind of how that works. It seems routine after a while, really. And of course, we have the ability to task collectors in the field and ask them if they can provide more information on X, Y, and Z, and to the extent that they can, they will. So there's definitely interaction there. It's not like you're just basically taking what you can get, right? You do, as an analyst, have the ability to kind of refine or filter or even broaden, right, the scope of information that you're receiving every day.
So yeah, I think that pretty much covers it. The second part of it that I wanted to go into, because I read a couple of your articles, especially the letter that you wrote to President Biden asking how Guantanamo should completely be shut and like the detainees need to go off and the entire project needs to be shut down. So do you think there is there's a repercussion, a negative repercussion, not just on the image of, say, the US, but otherwise on maybe the communities that were somehow affected because uh, of who the detainees were. So, are there any repercussions as such that communities come up with or uh, show after the incident happened, or after Guantanamo Bay came into being and there were detainees? And even I also read that you were involved in getting the detainees out into the real world again. So how does that gel around like the entire situation?
Yeah, I had the privilege of being able to support Obama's effort of moving some folks out of there, providing it. Like, I certainly wasn't involved in the negotiations related to that, but I was providing support to those to the people who were. So, yeah, that was 2 interesting years. In terms of ramification, I think that there's like 2 sets of ramifications or 2 sets of consequences that stem from a place like Guantanamo being open, and or maybe 3. So there's this huge black mark now on our reputation, because how do we tell China that it needs to close its concentration camps when we have what was essentially a concentration camp? Now, granted, it was on a much smaller scale, right? And the reasons were totally different, but you're still detaining human beings without any kind of trial, and you're in many cases torturing them. Well, how do we then send a message to the rest of the world? Hey, please follow our lead on human rights. You guys need to respect the rule of law. You need to respect human dignity, because we're all created in the image of God. We can't do that anymore because of this. And then there's the impact on recruitment, right? Once Guantanamo opened and you have this image of detainees walking around hooded and in orange jumpsuits, chained and shackled, you see that those images pop up in oppressive regimes all over the world. You see ISIS starting to use the orange jumpsuits right around 2010, 2011, right before they kill people. You see there was a gentleman who worked for the FBI and then contracted to do some work for CIA, a man named Bob Levinson, who went to the Iranian island of Kish and disappeared for more than a decade. He popped up about 5 years after he had been kidnapped in an orange jumpsuit, holding signs with references to Guantanamo. It just sort of inspired people around the world to want to take revenge and to want to kind of slap us in the face with it. And it was certainly a recruitment tool. Al-Qaeda, ISIS, they use this to inflame tensions, to raise the anger of people, rightly to some degree, to people overseas, to hate us because of what we were doing to their uncles and their brothers and their fathers, right? So and I can't say that I blame people for being angry about it, because it still makes me angry. but then there's also the whole notion here at home, well, and then this is very, very wrong, but I think this sentiment existed right after 9/11. Well, it's only Muslims who are being put in Guantanamo. This war is against people of Muslim ethnicity, right? Muslims must be suspicious people. Therefore, we need to watch out for these people. We need to treat them differently. They can't be our friends. They're outsiders. And I think that was a danger too. And it definitely caused tensions between Muslim communities and the rest of America to some degree, not because of anything these Muslims communities had done wrong, but because people were afraid. And just the existence, the claim that a place like Guantanamo was necessary scares a lot of people, because we know that was outside of the parameters of the US law and the Constitution. We knew exactly why they were doing it. We knew that it was wrong, but we were so scared we were willing to allow it. And so if we're willing to allow that, then why would I still feel obligated to treat my Muslim neighbor decently, right? And I think that's another part of the one of the dangers of opening a place like Guantanamo. And it just reaffirms or cements the fear that we were already feeling in our own hearts. And it definitely divided us in some very, very ugly ways.
As you were mentioning about this comes to the mind that in case you come across as a analyst an information that a person has been illegally detained because the person was at that place in the wrong time when the operation was carried on in Afghanistan or in Iraq, and the person has been illegally detained. But does that add an added pressure that if you make this public or you go to New York Times with this information, next day ISIS or Al Qaeda might use that as a poster image for recruitment?
Yeah, absolutely. I do think that there is a danger of terrorist groups using this notion that people who were innocent were detained, were imprisoned, and then these stories come out. I do think that there is some danger of that. Now, I would also caveat that with, it's been 20 years, right, since we first started the war on terror. It's been 20 years. So when these stories come out now, that so and so was in Guantanamo Bay, he's been there for 18 or 20 years, he's never been charged. There's no reason to believe that he ever had anything to do with Al Qaeda. He was just picked up because he was in the wrong place at the wrong time. I think that now everybody pretty much knows that we did some really dumb things, right? When we were detaining these people, right? People were in the wrong place at the wrong time. People were handed over for bounty by Pakistani officials in the region, by neighbors who were suspicious because, hey, this person isn't an Afghan, he's not ethnically Afghan, so what's he doing here? He must be fighting with Al Qaeda, right? Who really had nothing to do with terrorism at all. Those stories have largely come out. We know this. And I think at this point, when these stories break, like the one yesterday, Asadullah Harun Gold, the story of his court appearance was in the New York Times yesterday. Yeah. I don't think that necessarily is a danger. I don't think that that's necessarily a recruitment tool at this point, because those stories are already out there. We know there's not much else, in my view, that could come out in terms of war on terror abuses, or the boneheaded things that we did after 9/11 that is going to shock too many people at this point. I really cannot imagine what that would be. So probably not at this point, but it still definitely makes us look bad. I mean, it might not be a recruitment tool for ISIS, but what it does do is give the Communist Party of China room to say, look, they held people without charges who really weren't linked to terrorism, and they knew it for 20 years, and they're going to complain because we've got some Uyghurs that we've held for 20 months, right? That's, in my view, that's the bigger danger here.
Okay. So let me go back to the first question that I asked, and I'll revisit a bit and ask post 9/11, since we're talking about a little bit about human rights, and I hope it doesn't become an unbecoming of an American citizen to talk about human rights post 9/11, especially with all the comments that comes about since CIA is not a federal agency, but a CIA has the right or the ability to actually hold back a suspect for cross-examination, for interrogation before they hand it over to the FBI. And with a follow-up on about the Patriot Act. So does an intelligence agency have also the authority to go and establish unapproved surveillance on some people to trace the citizens? What China is doing today, that US somewhat did post 9/11.
So to answer the second question first, no, there is not any like unilateral CIA surveillance on people, at least domestically. That can't happen by CIA. CIA is not authorized to operate within the United States borders. That would be the purview of the FBI. And to the extent that the FBI is doing it, there are warrants that would have to be obtained, right? There's not any kind of, mass surveillance of ethnic groups or of mosques or of anything like that going on. If there's a belief that someone is engaged in terrorism or has ties to terrorism, then there's a legal process that you go through. You get a warrant, and then you can surveil to your heart's content within the parameters of that warrant, of course. But that would still be the FBI carrying out that kind of surveillance.
Can CIA detain a suspected person without in domestic condition without informing the FBI for interrogation and then probably hand it over to FBI?
So can CIA detain someone domestically?
Yeah,
Here
suspected of probably foreign funding.
So they cannot, CIA cannot detain anyone within the United States. That's just not something they can do. They're not, again, they're not law enforcement. So no, here at home, they cannot. Overseas, it's a little bit more murky, and I can't really be very specific. Certainly an argument has been made, and the practice has been that on the battlefield, right, of the war on terror, those kinds of detentions were permissible, but a lot of those were actually made in conjunction with the FBI. For example, if you go and you skim the first, well, I don't actually know how many pages in, but the Senate torture report, you'll find that CIA working in conjunction with FBI were involved in the operation that captured Abu Zubaydah. Right. But that was overseas. CIA was operating within its purview to do that. There had been an executive order, essentially, that the CIA could detain people for an unlimited period of time. I don't think the executive order actually stated a period of time. So yes, during the war on terror, and until that memo was rescinded, that certainly was permissible overseas. Here at home, absolutely not.
But on the same line, can you just shed some light? What is a CIA safe house in a foreign country that we hear often? Is that where a lot of these people are detained, a CIA safe house in a foreign country? Without going into classified stuff.
Yeah, I know. If you look at the Senate torture report, you'll see that number is somewhere around 100, 120 people that went through that CIA program. And I mean, I trust that report. I feel like it was accurate. So it is not something that they are in the business of doing. I'll say that. It's not something that they believe. I think that most people believe that is something that should happen rarely, right? And since the war on terror is winding down, I would be very surprised if that was happening very often, if at all.
My question was around, since you did mention China, how important, one is how relevant, and the second part is how frequently is intelligence in South Asian regions of major importance, and how?
So that's a good question. So I think that, and I need to be careful here, but I think that there's a lot that we need China for, and that might sound kind of odd because I've just said some pretty harsh things about its human rights practices. But in terms, I mean, China is a great power, right? It's the biggest country. It's probably the strongest country, or at least it wants us to believe it is in Asia. It is definitely one of the I can't honestly remember if China or India has the larger population at this point. Forgive me, but it is a huge country, right? There's a lot of people. It's responsible for a lot of trade. It has connections with its regional neighbors. It's doing some fairly provocative things, of course, in the South China Sea and with on the border with India and on the border with I think that I read something about a little skirmish with Burma or Vietnam. I can't recall the other day. It's got some growing pains, I guess, and it's pursuing growth in some very provocative and potentially dangerous ways. But at the same time, the United States or any other great power cannot maintain the international order by itself. Right after World War II, the U.S. and the Western countries came together and established this what's called the liberal international order, and that order has been responsible for general. I mean, obviously, it doesn't eliminate war, but the general peace and prosperity and stability of the world for the last 75 years. And I think that even China has benefited from that. And I believe Xi Jinping actually a few years ago acknowledged benefiting from it. And he even rhetorically posed the question, why would we want to change it? Well, it's pretty obvious since then that they do want to change it. The liberal part of the international order is something that Xi Jinping and the Communist Party really have no interest in. And I think that part of their danger is their international involvement in the world comes with no strings attached, right? The United States and the West, we try to at least, encourage states to engage in democratic reform, to free political prisoners, to do certain things in return for better trading benefits or other kinds of support from the United States. And China doesn't. And what China's doing now is exporting its model of authoritarianism throughout the world. It's selling surveillance equipment to other states, including Venezuela, including Serbia. It's got police operations going on in other states where it never did before. And it justifies that by saying we're here to keep Chinese citizens who are here on vacation or whatever safe. I'm like, no, you're not. You're there to teach these countries who already have authoritarian tendencies how to get away with doing what you're doing. You're teaching them how to create their own surveillance state. And I think that that is incredibly dangerous. And so I said all that to say, still we need China, right? We need China not to do those things for one, but we do need China to provide information on terrorist groups, terrorist movements through regions that it has its own operations in. We need China to participate in keeping Kim Jong-un in North Korea from further developing a nuclear program and becoming more of a threat, right? We need China to rein him in sometimes. We need China to pursue peaceful relations with its neighbors. We need China to not start a war with the Philippines over Whitsun Reef or Scarborough Shoal. We need China to do certain things, some which are just within the realm of decent state behavior, but some that actually help us, right? The terrorism stuff, the non-proliferation stuff, we need China to do that and to cooperate with us because we do have common interests there. We need China to cooperate in terms of climate change, right? I mean, China's emissions are I think the greatest of any state on the globe. So we need China to be willing to rein those in and to kind of be willing to delay some development in return for a cleaner planet where we can all prosper and therefore have money to buy the stuff that they're producing. So we need China to do certain things, but at the same time, China is definitely still, I guess I would use the term a strategic competitor. I don't like to say that they're a threat, but I do think that ideologically they are a threat to freedom and democracy across the globe. I will say that. And so you mentioned South Asia or other parts of Asia. I think that we need the countries, especially in South Asia, that have been fairly strong allies of us, not like military allies, but friends of us economically, in terms of assisting in even intelligence sharing operations or in terms of shared common interests, right? Freedom of navigation through the South China Sea. So I'm thinking countries like Malaysia or Singapore or Indonesia. We need those countries to kind of stay in our camp, right? We need to maintain a good relationship with all of those countries. And I think that to a large degree, we do have that, but that doesn't mean that China isn't going to try to cause a rift there. Maybe cause a rift with the Philippines, maybe cause a rift with Malaysia or with Indonesia. I think that there's probably a lot of ways that they could do that through trade, through economic coercion, all of those things. But we're going to need to really worry about those relationships, I think, and take care to nurture those relationships so that we don't lose them.
So I had certain questions with regards to your previous answer, wherein you mentioned how over the years things have changed and China's also come to be a strategic competitor, strategic competition, as you mentioned. So there are again two questions. One is, so debt trap diplomacy is something that China has frequently practiced, whether it be in the regions around South China Sea, or whether it be towards, say, Sri Lanka, or whether it be towards Pakistan, right? And a lot of their ability to penetrate these regions comes from that very factor, that debt is owed to them. So one is that, and the second is how the international order has eventually moved from unipolarity to bipolarity, and now towards multipolarity to an extent. I won't say entirely, because of course, though none of the countries are at the same level, but to a certain extent towards multipolarity. Do you feel these two factors are somehow very important to the answer that you just gave before, with regards to how China can play a role in actually facilitating some efforts?
Yeah, I mean, so first about the debt trap diplomacy, I'll answer the first question first so I don't forget it. So about that, I do think that is how China is trying to create. I mean, if you used the unipolar, bipolar, multipolar dimension later, I think that China is trying to create its pole or its satellite states, whatever, by using this debt trap diplomacy, right? They're trying to basically force states into their sphere of influence. And once you're in, unfortunately, I think it's going to be very, very difficult for these states to get out. And I think that's one of the reasons that the US needs to be really careful and pay attention to its allies in the region, so that they don't feel like their only option is to go into China's sphere of influence. But yeah, China's expeditionary foreign policy or economic policy here in this regard really concerns me, because I do think that there are states for whom this relationship is going to be something that they can't refuse. I'm very concerned that people in the United States government are not paying enough attention to that. And I could be wrong, right? It's a new administration. What do I know? I don't know how they're thinking about it yet. They've been definitely focused on COVID and other things that are in the short term much more important. So I hope they're focused on that. But I think that that's how China is trying to create its sphere of influence. Obviously, it has hegemonic aspirations for the region. It wants us out so that it can be, the hegemon in Asia, if not, maybe not all of Asia yet, but at least in East Asia. And of course, that would be totally flying in the face of US interests. And that's something that should scare us. In terms of like what the international order is going to look like, or what China wants it to look like. China definitely wants it to be multipolar or bipolar, I guess. I'm not sure if China believes that there's a third, pole here in the equation. I think China sees this as a bipolar construct, right? That it is rising, no one else is rising to the level that it is. And we could certainly argue about whether that's true, about whether the EU is really out of the game, or whether India is a player or not. And I happen to think it is. But in terms of how China looks at it, I think China sees it as it's us versus the United States. And we're in competition economically for our, China's generally a capitalistic country, but it wants capitalism on its own terms, of course. But there's definitely ideological competition here. And China would love for, democracy and freedom and Western liberalism to be the loser here. And that's going to be dangerous for citizens throughout the world, I think. And that's what really scares me. In terms of the US, I think the United States is going to have to be willing to some degree to acknowledge that, hey, it's not going to be a unipolar world forever. We're going to have competition. It is going to be China. And how are we going to manage a China that is as strong and active internationally as the Soviet Union was? Because that is really the concern. Is China going to have a global navy that they're going to field? Well, it sure looks like they're going in that direction. Is China going to, be flying its planes over U.S. territory or offshore, like Russia or the Soviet Union did, and Russia still does, at least in Alaska? Is China going to do that? How adventurous are they going to get? And I think that we need to assume that they're going to be as provocative, as adventurous as the Soviet Union ever was. And I think if we don't assume that, it's to our peril.
I just want to, for the viewers, if you could just give your recruitment story. It's very interesting. You were pursuing a PhD when you recruited, right? So if you could tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah. So I was in graduate school at the University of Arizona in Tucson. I was studying political science, and I was still trying to figure out, I knew I wanted to work for the government, and I was still trying to figure out exactly how I wanted to do that. So I had thought about becoming a foreign service officer, and that path seemed to close after some time. And there were CIA recruiters on campus, and I just, on a whim, handed them my resume, which was not much because I was in grad school and what had I done? But a lot of my work at the time was focused on China. I did a research paper on the Chinese Constitution and how it had evolved over time, and on human rights and all of these things. And apparently that got somebody's attention. And within 2 weeks, I had a job offer. So I was thrilled, and I left, and I didn't finish my PhD. But it was the best decision I ever made, because even though I am pretty harsh on the CIA in terms of its torture program, and deservedly so, right? There's nothing good about it. The CIA gave me the best almost 12 years of my life. I got to work with the smartest people I have ever known in my life. They made me smarter. They made me better. I learned a ton, and they gave me a lot of opportunities that I would not have imagined ever happening. I mean, I got to travel overseas, which I didn't expect to do ever in life, right? I got to represent my country, my government. It was a great opportunity. So I tell my students, because now I teach, obviously, I tell my students not to assume that those kinds of jobs are for somebody else, because they certainly, if I can get hired, right, certainly they can, if they study hard and do the right things. So yeah, that was my path anyway.
And can you still recruit students?
I cannot. I have no recruiting authority. I will teach them everything that they need to know. I will teach them stuff that I wish I had heard before I started working there. Because I'll be honest, as a reasonably young person at the time, when news of our torture program broke, that really hit me hard, because I, like most of my students, grew up believing that we don't do that. Right? This is the United States. We are the bastion of human rights in the world, right? This shining city on a hill. And while that's very idealistic and a little bit naive to still believe that, when you're an adult, I think that there is some truth to it, right? Because why do so many immigrants want to come here, right? It's because there's something different about America. And America has done much more good than
the American dream
in this world. Yeah, exactly. And so one of the things that I try to teach my students is, at some point if you're working in national security, you're going to be hit with a huge ethical dilemma, and it's going to be a gut punch to you, and you're not going to know how to react to it, right? So I try to walk with them through my journey. Like, how do you deal with it when you realize the agency I work for is being accused of running this torture program, and I am not okay with that morally, right? And as a government employee, you have no ability to protest. You can't go to the press, obviously, and of course I never did and never would. You can't express your views about it on Facebook, right? You're not supposed to have a social media presence. You might be able to talk to your family about it, but they can't really help you decide what ethically you're supposed to do, because your employer is torturing and you're being paid by this. It's a real dilemma. And so, I try to tell students how I watched through that, how I processed that. And for me, that was, I'm not doing anything immoral. I'm not doing anything that I'm ashamed of. I'm totally ashamed of what we've done over here, but that's not me personally. And I can still bring a lot to this job. I bring integrity to this job. If given the opportunity, I would, speak up and say, hey, we can't do that. I would never have allowed that to happen, or I would have walked out had that happened in front of me. So then what do you do about it? Well, find places where you can do good, where you can try to redeem what was done to the best of your ability. And so I think that for me, that was why I ended up spending my last 2 years working on detainee issues, because that was my way of trying to make a difference for these people who we had really, really wronged in so many ways. And that's why I still speak out now. So I try to tell my students, there's not one right thing to do. If you're presented with an issue like, do I torture or not? Yes, there's only one right thing to do, and that's to not do it. But in terms of, do I stay there? What do I do? That's a dilemma you have to walk through on your own. And so I pose some hypotheticals to them. I ask them what they would do under certain circumstances, and I make it very clear that I'm not looking for a right answer, but you need to start thinking about this, because at some point in your career, you're gonna be presented with an ethical dilemma that's going to tear you up, and it might not be torture, it might be something else, but be thinking about what your moral responsibilities to those things actually are. So I hope that I do have students who have gone on to work in various national security positions. Thankfully, I'm really grateful, and I'm so proud of those students. They're definitely excellent students and excellent human beings. And I have no doubt that if they're ever put in those positions of what do I do, that they're going to do the right thing. So
I have asked this question to a lot of intelligence analysts or officers who have worked in the agencies, and especially most of those people have worked in the agency when the 9/11 happened. And every one of us, we were too young to have a 9/11 memory, but every intelligence officer have 9/11 memory. But you weren't in the agency that time. You were like 2 years before joining the agency, 2 to 3 years before. So how did 9/11 change your perspective of how you look at terrorism, or did it make any impact of you joining the agency?
So 9/11 for me was hard. It was hard. It hit me hard. I didn't think that we could ever be hit here at home. Like, I didn't think that I would ever see buildings in any American city burning and collapsing with those kinds of casualties. So it hit me hard. I mean, I was in graduate school at the time. I was teaching a discussion section of international politics, and students weren't sure what to make of that either. And I was young then. I was not the best person to walk them through that. But I remember our university put up a wall of, I think they called it a wall of remembrance, and it was across the main campus, and students were allowed to write any feelings that they had, unfortunately the good and the bad, and things took a real ugly turn. There was hate towards every group, not just Muslims, which was shameful. There were calls to kill various people, various politicians. And it got really scary really fast. And I think that the impact that had on me was I wanted I wanted to be a part of not just keeping the country safe, right? And certainly not just in terms of terrorism, because I'd never worked a terrorism account at the agency, not even close. But I think for me, it was the importance of having people who were committed to keeping the country safe, yeah, to a certain degree, but across the board. We need good people who understand the various dynamics overseas, who understand the culture of the countries and the people that they're writing about. We need good people who understand the origins of some of the grievances that are out there. And I think that was one of the things that made me feel like, hey, I think that I do have some of that cultural understanding, at least when it comes to China or East Asia. And this is something I really need to do. You know, whether it's CIA service or State Department service or wherever, this is something that I really need to do. And I think that I'm well equipped to do. And I don't know, I think that was my rationale for getting into the agency. And then after I started, and I mean, I obviously had no point of comparison because I wasn't there before 9/11, but 9/11 definitely formed the views of the people that I would work with, because you had people who would still talk about watching that plane that ended up going into the Pentagon, basically flying down the Potomac before it hit, and they could feel the building shaking because it was so close. The fear that was in everybody when the building was evacuated, right? I mean, that was still very, very much palpable, I think. And I think that really, at least for new hires who came in right after 9/11, and even as late as me in early 2003, I think that drove home the seriousness of what it was that we were doing there, right? Because you could see when your colleagues are retelling the story, and you can see the blood drain from their face, right? It was terrifying. And you want to keep that from happening to people that you know, not just in the building, but to your family who lives, you know, in Pennsylvania or California or Iowa. You just want to keep that fear from being visited on anybody again for any reason. And I think that was, it sounds a little scary and morbid, I think, but on the flip side of that, I think it was almost inspiring. It's like, this is our goal, this is our mission, is keeping the country safe. So, for us, I think it was a motivational thing.
What's the work of an analyst here is like? How does that information that you receive, you end as a product that you can make sense of and the policymakers can use it? If you can give an example and you can tell to the, because most of them are students who are watching, and we hear this term analyst a lot. It's a desk job. A lot of people might feel it boring, but you are the guys who actually make all the differences out there, and that's how the operation comes. So if you can give an example and tell how this happens.
So it's definitely, being an analyst is a desk job, and you're mostly stationed in Washington, D.C., although sometimes you do get to travel, which is a lot of fun. But it was never boring for me, right? Once you've been there for a while, right? Once you've been on the job for a while, you know what issues matter to policymakers. You know what they're following. You probably briefed them a few times. You've had conversations with them. You know when they're going to go to a summit with, Xi Jinping or Angela Merkel. You know when the next APEC summit is going to be and who's going to go there and represent the United States. You know when these big things are happening. So you know what they need. You know what they need to know about. And you know what you should sort of warn them about. And so once you develop that gut instinct, and that only comes from being on the job for a while, you basically start looking through your morning, we call it traffic. So everything that comes into your inbox, everything that comes into your computer overnight. So everything that you're going through, you're kind of mentally checking in your mind. Okay, well, does this mean anything for the Secretary of Commerce? Does this mean anything for the USTR? Does this mean anything for the Defense Secretary? Or I know that the person who runs the China desk at State is having a meeting. It's a pretty low-level meeting, but does he need to know any of this stuff? So you go through this checklist, and sometimes the answer is yes. And when the answer is yes, you put pen to paper with your management's blessing, right? Because sometimes your management is going to say, I don't think this makes the threshold. I don't think we're quite there yet. I don't think that there's enough information for you to make a convincing argument yet. So you might want to wait a couple of days and see what else trickles in. And that can happen, and that can be frustrating because sometimes when you're enthusiastic, you don't like to be told to wait. But there's usually a reason for it. And so once you can put pen to paper, it's a pretty, well, it can be a fairly quick process, sometimes not. It depends on the number of people who have an equity in whatever it is that you're writing. So if you're writing a piece on, what's China's military modernization mean, you're going to have a lot of people weighing in on that, because you're going to have military analysts, you're going to have political analysts, you're going to have people who focus on the cross-strait relationship with Taiwan. You're going to have all sorts of people across the agency who think that they have an equity, and they probably do, and they're going to want to weigh in on it. And that part takes time. And you can imagine that if you write a research paper for college, and then you have to have 25 people come in and take a look at that and rewrite it for you 25 different ways, it can be maddening at times. And so there's a lot of you develop some diplomatic skills. You develop you mature really quickly when you have to deal with this kind of feedback constantly. If you don't, you're not going to succeed particularly easily. And so you kind of negotiate language, right? It's like, well, this person over here thinks I'm overreacting here, or that I'm overselling. Is he right? And this person's really smart and he's got all this experience. Is there any truth or validity in what he's saying? And so you might decide, yes, there is. And so you might temper your language a little bit, right? And not say this is going to happen next week, but this could happen next week, right? It's kind of an issue of degree. And so at some point that negotiation process is going to be over, and it's going to go through an editing process. Now that can be really frustrating too, because you're going to have people who don't know anything about your issue think that, well, this language sounds better. And it's like, well, okay, but if you use that word in this culture or in this context, that word means something that I'm not trying to convey, so we can't use that word. And so then there's another whole set of negotiations over language that happens. And it goes through, depending on what it is you're writing and who you're writing for, it might not have any kind of input from outside the agency, but if you're writing for the president, it does. So then you have to deal with that level of coordination as well. People in the the Office of the Director of National Intelligence end up reading it before it gets to the president as well, if it's for the president. And then finally, his briefer will take the piece, read the piece, and take it to the president whenever his scheduled briefing is. And hopefully the president reads it. That's always a plus, right? It's really cool to be able to say, the president has read my work, right? That's what every analyst aspires to. And even better when the president gives you feedback, right? Sometimes, rarely, and it depends on the president, they'll write a note in the margin, right? Sometimes the briefer will write the note in the margin for him. And usually if there is feedback, the briefer conveys that to you when he comes back to the building. So it's definitely a give and take process. And it's like I said, it's really cool to write for the president of the United States. When you have all these academics out there who write all these huge articles and spend all these years doing research, and the president doesn't read their stuff, right? But he reads what you write. It's pretty cool, I have to say. And every analyst, aspires to being able to write those pieces. So the process is a little bit stressful when you write for the president, but it should be, right? Because you want your best work to go to him.
So before people start asking in the comment section, as I was talking about it here the day before when I spoke to you, how can a person join the agency, and how can an immigrant join the agency? In two different ways, if you can answer.
CIA, being hired by the CIA requires American citizenship. So if you are a citizen, and I don't know how long you have to be one, like I don't think that there is a minimum number of years, but to be honest, I don't know that for sure. but you do have to be a US citizen. You have to be able to pass a background investigation, of course. You
So what does that involve in the background investigation?
They talk to people who've known you for a certain number of years, depending on your age, a certain number of years. They go back. I honestly can't remember the number of years. It's been a while since my last one, obviously. And it's just basically, you know, are you suitable? Do you do anything blackmailable, right? Are you a law-abiding citizen? Those are the kinds of vague things that they're looking for. Sometimes they can go pretty quickly. So like my background investigation, my first one, I think it began in October and it was finished in February, but I was a grad student. I'd never left the country. Excuse me. My family, gosh, I don't even know if my family had taken very few trips abroad, and ironically, they took them without me. So there was really nothing to investigate there on my part. So mine was over pretty quickly, but I have had friends whose background investigations will take up to a year. It just depends on how easy it is to track people down, on how much time you've spent overseas. It just depends, honestly. So people get really scared. They think it's an intense process. The paperwork is kind of intense. It's honestly, if you're not committing crimes, there's no reason to be intimidated by this process. And if you are committing crimes, you probably should not apply because those will be found out. So I think it's something that people talk about as being really scary and really intimidating. And I did not find it to be that way at all.
And is there a polygraph test involved as well?
Is there a polygraph? Is that what you said? Yeah, there at some point there is. That part can be intimidating for sure. Anytime they hook your body up to anything, it's a little bit scary. And that's pretty much all I can say about that, to be honest. But yeah, there is a polygraph test involved in this process. You know, when it's your first one, you don't know what to expect, and there's nothing anybody could say to prepare you for it. But I will say it's not as bad as people make that out to be.
But I've heard from someone in that when you're in the agency, you could really get like a habit of those polygraph tests because somewhere or the other you need to go through at least a couple of times in your career. Is that true?
There are reinvestigations. There will be reinvestigations. Anyone and in any position where you have to hold a top secret clearance, you will be reinvestigated at a certain point in your career. It's every so many number of years, and there will be a new polygraph as part of that process. That's a lot of fun.
Okay, nobody so this is the last question.
Nobody wants to take time out of their day to do that. So.
I can understand. And all this happens in Langley, Virginia, or in Washington, D.C.
I don't want to say that it all does. It's probably like once you are hired, it could happen wherever you are stationed. I honestly don't know. I mean, I lived in Northern Virginia, so mine obviously happened there.
Okay. So this is my last question. I was talking about this with you the other day as well. The statement comes from, can I name the person if you're comfortable? A former CI director.
Go ahead.
He makes a statement about the role of a woman in the agency, and he gives a supposed statement of a woman approaching him and talking certain things. I'll just put the tweet out there, but there has been multiple instances where male officers have come out there and given a picture of how women officers who are working are treated. But if you could give a sense of how women officers or analysts have played an important role in the agency, or what their role has been from chasing down Bin Laden to chasing down Chakraborty.
Yeah, so the agency has made, I think, a concerted effort in recent years, maybe the last decade or so, to step up hiring and promotion of women. I think that's been a focus of theirs. And women have played some pretty key roles, like you said, in the search for Osama bin Laden, in the search for Zarqawi, in several other instances as well that have been fairly public. And I think that I think it's important to have that perspective. I mean, why would you not want to hire half the population, right? Why limit the mental capacity of half of the potential recruiting pool? That's silly. So yeah, I saw Pompeo's tweet. I was a little bit horrified by it. I don't for a minute believe that there are a lot of individuals in the CIA who only hire or promote women based on their sexuality. That's absolutely ridiculous. I mean, obviously, I couldn't say that it never happens, but you can't say that it never happens anywhere, right? In any big corporation, you're going to have one or two people who are going to say something stupid or do something stupid or inappropriate or illegal to a female employee. And when that happens, that should be reported and punished appropriately, obviously. But I never encountered any kind of widespread discrimination or inappropriate comments directed at me or any of my other female colleagues. That wasn't something that happened. I mean, to be a woman at the CIA, it was a comfortable place to be. It was a welcoming workforce. If you had children and you took 3 months off to bond with your child, that was encouraged, that was embraced, that was like, your manager wouldn't say anything to you except you'd better send me baby pictures, right? I mean, it was a family, and nobody was treated like anything other than that. That was never my experience. It was always wonderful. I once was sick and I had to come back from an overseas trip early. I had people meeting me at the airport just to make sure I was okay. I mean, I certainly wasn't immobile or anything. I could get myself home, but that was just the way they approached everyone, not just me. I had surgery. I had back surgery once, 2 days before or 3 days before Christmas, and was stuck in the hospital on Christmas Eve without a ride home. And my team chief came in and drove me home. Right? I mean, it was like the best place with the best people that I have ever worked with in my life. And so when Secretary, Director, whatever his title is now, Pompeo comes out and makes a statement like that, as a woman, I find it offensive because it implies that happens regularly at the agency and only didn't because of him. And I don't believe that is the case at all. That just doesn't ring true to me.
I mean, we can also disregard, you don't have to answer this, but we can also disregard the fact what Mike Pompeo said, from the very fact that he also in 2018, around 2017, 2018, he met Russian spies on US soil. And after that, if you remember, the question answers that were being asked from Senate Sumo, and he did not even answer any question related to election interference, cyber attacks, and anything. So a person who has met Russian spies on US soil talking about ethics on a workspace is questionable itself.
I think that you can definitely say that is true. Yeah, his behavior in a lot of respects, I think, and this is not this is just based on what I've read, because obviously I never worked for him. Forcing people to give up their work time to go run errands for him, right? Forcing people to go walk his dog or bring his dog back from the groomer, right? There was a lot of ethical issues, I think, that surrounded Secretary Pompeo. And I think that there might be some arguments that he should probably just sit out and not weigh in on at all.
Thank you so much for taking your time and being on the show. It's an honor to host you. And most importantly, I think we covered a lot of grounds that was important. So thank you so much.
You're very welcome. Thanks for inviting me. I hope this was useful. Thank you so much.